Welcome to episode 83 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please visit EpicureanFriends.com. There you'll find our goals and our ground rules, and if you have any questions about anything you hear in this podcast, you can contact us there and ask for more information. In this episode 83, we'll read approximately Latin lines 68 through 164, and we'll continue to open Book 6 and begin a discussion of natural explanations for meteorological phenomena such as thunder and lightning. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Unless you purge your mind of such conceits and banish them from your breast, and forbear to think unworthily of the gods, by charging them with things that break their peace, those sacred deities you will believe are always angry and offended with you. Not that the supreme power of the gods can be so ruffled as to be eager to punish severely in their resentments, but because you fancy those beings who enjoy a perfect peace in themselves are subject to anger and the extravagances of revenge. And therefore you will no more approach their shrines with an easy mind. No more in tranquility and peace will you be able to receive the images, the representations of the divine forms, that form from their pure bodies and strike powerfully upon the minds of men. From hence you may collect what a wretched life you are to lead. That the rules, therefore, of right reason may keep these evils at the greatest distance from us, so I have offered many things upon this subject before, yet much still remains to be observed, which I shall adorn with the smoothest verse. And first, the nature and phenomena of the heavens must be explained. And now I sing of tempests and the flaming blasts of light, how they fly and from what cause they dart through all the air. Lest, when you view the several parts of heaven, you tremble and, mad with superstitions, ask whence comes this winged fire, and to what quarter of heaven does it direct its course? How does it pierce through walls of stone, and having spent its rage, goes out again? The causes of which events, since men cannot assign by the laws of reason, they must, they suppose, be affected by the power of the gods. And so Calliope, my skillful muse, the joy of men and pleasure of the gods, lead on the course and guide me to the goal, that by thy conduct I may gain a crown and end the race with glory. First, the blue arch of heaven is shaken with thunder, because the airy clouds, flying aloft, are forced by adverse winds and strike together. For where the sky is clear, you hear no noise, but where the clouds are thick and drive in troops, thence comes a louder sound and murmurs through the air. Besides, the clouds are not so solid in their contexture as stones and wood, nor so thin as mists and flying smoke, for then, depressed by their own weight, they would either fall abruptly down as stones, or like smoke they would disperse, and not be able to keep in the chilling snow and showers of hail. There gives a crack through the wide space of heaven, as curtains strained upon the posts and beams in lofty theatres, when ruffled by the boisterous winds and blown to pieces, they make a rattling noise like paper torn. This thunder, you observe, will sound like clothes spread out, or flying sheets, when tossed by strokes of wind they roll and flutter through the sky. And sometimes the clouds will not directly meet and engage front to front, but in their different motions will rudely shock the sides of one another as they pass. Hence comes that dry crashing sound we hear, that lasts for some time before it breaks its close prison and rolls out. All things you see from hence will shake and tremble at the dreadful clap, and the heavens, the mighty walls of this wide world, are torn and burst asunder in a moment, when a collected force of restless wind gets suddenly within a cloud, and there enclosed it rolls furiously about, and stretches the hollow space still more and more, until the sides grow thick and are condensed, and when it summons its whole strength, and rages to get free, then comes a frightful break. It flies abroad with horrid noise. Nor is this strange, when a small bladder full of wind will likewise give a mighty crack when it is suddenly burst. When the winds strike violently upon the clouds, this may produce a noise, for we see the branch clouds, with their rough edges, are driven about in various manners, as a blast of southwest winds, blowing hard upon the thick woods. The boughs give a sound, and the branches rattle through the air. And sometimes the violent force of a fierce wind will beat directly, with all its rage, upon a cloud and cut it asunder. That the winds will shatter the clouds is evident by experience, for here below, where their power is much weaker, they will overturn the strongest trees and tear them up by the roots. And then the clouds, like waves, roll about in the wide ocean of the air and cause a roaring noise by dashing together. The same happens in large rivers and in the wide sea when it is broken and rages with the tide. And sometimes the fiery force of lightning falls from one cloud into another. If a cloud full of moisture receives this fire, it extinguishes it with great noise, as a red-hot iron just taken out of the glowing heat hisses when we plunge it hastily into cold water. But if a dry cloud receives a flame, it takes fire instantly and rattles in the air, as when a fire, raging with mighty force, is driven by rushing winds upon a hill covered with laurels and sets all in a blaze. For nothing burns with more dreadful noise and cracking flame than the leaves of the Delphic laurel sacred to Apollo. And lastly, pieces of ice and showers of hail enclosed in mighty clouds will often sound like thunder, for the winds have driven and pressed them close. These mountainous clouds, being condensed, will burst and discharge their weight of ice and hail. It lightens when the clouds, by violent strokes in meeting, beat out many seeds of fire and strike as flint and steel, or stone and stone, for then the light leaps out and scatters shining sparks of fire. But we never hear the thunderclap till we have seen the lightning, for the images of things approach our ears much slower than they reach our eyes. This you prove when you observe a fellow at a distance is cutting down a tree. You see the blow struck before you hear the stroke. And so we see the lightning before we hear the thunder. So the noise and flame fly out together and proceed from the same cause, the same shock and bursting of the clouds.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that for us today. Maybe not quite as much deep content as last week, but still a lot of interesting material. And I'm particularly going to be interested in hearing some of your scientific analysis of the descriptions of the thunders and things like that. But before we get started into the science of the atmospheric, I guess is the right word, phenomena, we have a couple of paragraphs that continue on from last week about the more general aspects, and the very first one being the general aspect of how to think about the gods. And as further introduction to this, we've had some discussions on the forum over the last week or so about the distinctions between the Epicureans and the Stoics. And I saw that one of the positions that this particular video we were talking about took about that difference was that he said that the Epicureans advised that the gods should be ignored. And I think that's not correct, and that this paragraph here would be a reason for that, an explanation for that. Whether you take the idealistic view of the gods or whether you take sort of a realistic view of the gods that Epicurus thought they really existed, it does seem that Epicurus thought that it was important to have a positive and firm view of the gods. And so rather than ignoring them, I would say that he thought it was important to have a firm position on them. Now I've gone on too long. Who wants to comment on that first paragraph?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, Epicurus in his writings definitely seems to, acknowledge, and Philodemus in his writings, that, the gods are an important topic, because that's the first principle doctrine. The first principle doctrine talks about the blessed beings and that sort of thing. But you have to have the correct view of them, as opposed to the one where they're going to rain down punishment on your head and that they're concerned with every little action that you take.
Yeah, in elaborating on that, sometimes we talk about whether Epicurus is taking a practical position or a rigorously logical, theoretical position on certain things, and who he's talking to and so forth. I always come back to the idea that's in my own mind that Epicurus knows that he wants to talk to ordinary people, right. And a lot of ordinary people are never going to be able to get out of their minds this worry about the gods. I guess many of us today, especially the more advanced you get into the science of physics and think about things, you get comfortable with the idea that gods are just not something that you should be worried about. And so it just drops out of your mind and doesn't become a constant source of discomfort or threats to your peace of mind. But I do think that as a practical reality, the great majority of the people in the world are not in that camp. They're always going to have these nagging doubts about religion and the gods, and they need something to fill that spot in their minds and something to hold on to. When the topic regularly comes up, I think they need something that's going to be the quick and easy to understand position to take. And so by taking the position that perfect gods are not going to be concerned about what we do any more than we are concerned about what ants do, or as an analogy. I do think that gives a lot of people something to hold on to fix in their minds a position about religion that they can be confident of and not just be constantly plagued by doubts about it.
Lucretius is even saying, it seems to me, that whenever people are looking for an explanation for things, that they fall back on the whole idea, well, it's the God's will, or I have to pay attention to what the gods want, or they're going to be mad at me. And if you don't understand lightning and thunder, which is what he's going to go through for X number of lines here, that it's easy to just fall back on those easy black and white answers for complex problems. And I think the gods afford a solution to that.
Right.
I should say the gods misunderstood provide a solution.
Right. When people need to be practical and actually confront the problems that are in front of them, and not just simply pray to the gods for things and answers that they need to be dealing with themselves.
Right.
Oh my gosh, it seems like the current context of the world, I see so many of my friends and the people I'm associated with in day-to-day life, and when you in dealing with something like COVID-19, there's just so much discussion of let's pray that we get well, that God protects us from this plague, and if they do get sick, it's pray, when in fact, at least from my perspective personally, there's so many more practical things that need to be done. And if you just let yourself get caught up into prayer and letting God take care of it, or fatalism about that there's nothing you can do to affect anything, then you're not going to take the steps that you could otherwise take to potentially save your life or save the lives of your friends. And go ahead.
One of the memes that I've seen recently is that, they say that the COVID virus is everywhere. God is everywhere too. And I'm thinking, my first thought to that was, well, can we get a vaccine for him too?
That's right. Oh my gosh, there's so many different cliches like that floating around. Martin, I'm again droning on. Do you have thoughts on this particular point?
No, because it's just a resumption of what Lucretius had in earlier passages already, so that the gods should not be feared and that we should not stick to those old superstitions concerning the gods.
Mm-hmm. And Lucretius really does seem to do that. He seems to recapitulate a lot of things just to sort of emphasize it over and over. And if he hasn't mentioned it for a while, he brings it up again to okay, now remember, I said this back a while ago, but I'm going to re-emphasize it now. And that seems to be a recurring theme throughout the poem.
Yeah. So we can just pass on, as already discussed, things like that form from their pure bodies that strike powerfully upon the minds of men. I mean, I don't know whether these are really serious and that people have these forms striking powerfully upon their minds or not. But regardless of that, the bottom line is the same, that religion is a concern for many, many people. And even those of us who have largely dismissed it as a concern are constantly affected by people around us for whom it is a concern. And so there's just many aspects to that warrant, like you said earlier in the podcast here, Don, it's the number one principal doctrine. It's the first. Right. And although it's sometimes hard to look at the 40 doctrines and figure out exactly the priority ranking that he's given to each one, it's hard to dismiss that when you place something first, that you're saying that there's some importance to it.
And he does the same thing in the letter to Meteorology too. So.
Right. There's no doubt he thought it was a tremendously important topic that if you did not get right, you would be leading a wretched life.
And I think it's also the whole idea. I mean, we've talked too about the whole idea of the physics are the foundation upon which the philosophy is built. And I think having a right view of religion and the gods is another one of those sort of foundational bricks that if, it's not there, that you can't really start building on top of it because it makes it for a wobbly foundation.
Yeah, I really think that he considered this to be a part of physics, this whole topic. I know a lot from a practical point of view. I know in the forum, when I try to organize different things, I would dividing philosophy down between physics, ethics, and epistemology, which I think is sort of a traditional breakdown. And within those three, that's probably God's probably come under physics, under the nature of the universe, because taking a position as to whether how gods fit into the nature of the universe is extremely important. So, okay. so that the rules of right reason can keep these evils at the greatest distance upon us. I've offered many things before, and yet there are many things still to be observed, which we shall adorn with the smoothest verse. And first, the nature and phenomenons of the heavens must be explained. And I know Don's thinking of, I really like the way he says, I sing of tempests and the flaming blasts of lightning.
Ah. He does have a way with words, I'll tell you. It's,
yes,
indeed. It's one of the reasons that I haven't, learned Latin. I can look it up in dictionaries. I got some basic understanding of the grammar and stuff. But Lucretius is one of those things that, it would be nice to really be able to appreciate the Latin.
Yeah, because if this is an inaccurate translation or transposition of the emotion of it, about the flaming blasts of lightning, how they fly and from what cause they dart through the air, lest when you view the several parts of heaven you tremble, and mad with superstition ask whence comes this winged fire, and to what quarter of heaven does it direct its course. Yeah, it's very dramatic, it seems like. And the causes of which events, since men cannot assign by laws of reason, they suppose, be affected by the power of the gods.
There it is again. Yep.
We probably ought to be mentioning in this context the part in Diogenes Laertius where he talks about the idea of waiting, because when they talk about cannot assign by the laws of reason and that they suppose be affected by the power of the gods, I think that's part of the Epicurean analysis as well, is that you have to keep in mind that when you do not have enough evidence to come to a conclusion, you don't come to a conclusion until you get that evidence. And if you can't get it, you hold it, you put it in a different category of thought.
Right.
You don't act like it's something that's certain and that you can never doubt or challenge. So that waiting thing that is directly in Diogenes Laertius is pretty critical here.
Yeah.
And Martin, you probably have something to add on. The Diogenes Laertius part I'm talking about, where he talks about Epicurus came up with this idea of waiting. How would you describe that in the way you think?
Yeah, if there's no need to take a position and the evidence is not clear, then just waiting is the right thing to do. Of course, if we need to take action because of some urgency, then we need to do a best guess. But if the evidence isn't clear enough, it's better than to wait if we don't have to take immediate action.
That's a really good contextual way to look at that, I think. That's well put, Martin. If it's not an emergency, you can wait for additional evidence. But if you have to take action, you have to make a good enough guess. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Oh, I had to look up. You sort of challenged me there, so I had to look up the Latin, and so it does actually say flying fire in the original, the volans ignis. Uh-huh. So that's so the flying fire. That's a great line.
Okay, last week we talked about the Calliope reference, and so I don't guess we came up with anything new on that since last week.
That's just a teaser to make people go back and listen to last week's episode.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that by thy conduct I may gain a crown and end the race with glory. So there's been I think a number of references to this being a race and to gaining a victory at the end of it. This is not the only one. But okay, now, Don, we get into the section that you've been waiting for about the thunder, the lightning, and all of the fire and brimstone.
Paiana Nox.
And what does Paiana Nox mean?
That's Epicurus's expletive for.
And how does it translate literally?
I think. Now you put me on the spot.
I was thinking you had that one at the tip of your tongue.
Well, I have the Greek at the tip of my tongue. I don't have the English. It's a reference to Apollo, I know. So it's basic. I think it's basically my God.
Okay, yeah, right, probably so. We'll come back to that though. I'm sure after I ask you that question, we'll get it fixed.
Yeah, I was looking. I keep saying I've been dreading that. It looks like there's like about 1,000 lines of thunder and lightning and earthquakes, and I'm like, oh man. And then he finally starts talking about disease, and you were talking about the plague of Athens and that sort of thing. But I'm like, there's a lot of meteorological and geological phenomena here to wade through in the next few hundred lines.
Well, of course, I've been building it up because this is another area of expertise of our friend Martin from Germany, who's the expert in everything physics related. So I'm sure meteorology
no pressure, Martin.
Exactly, is the topic he's as well versed on as everything else in physics. But this paragraph 96 One part of that interests me is that the discussion of the texture, basically, of the clouds, that they're not mist and flying smoke, because then they'd either fall down or, like smoke, they would disperse. I'm not really sure what it is that keeps a cloud together. When you look up in the sky and you see all these fluffy white things, what does keep them together, Martin? Do you know?
Oh, that one I couldn't just say out of the pocket. But actually there are like mists, no? So a mist, what we see here on the ground, is basically clouds on the ground. No? And up there in the clouds, there nothing else than typically the mist. But that can come in with variations. So some are just like the mist we normally know, that it's liquid, the small droplets of water. But in other cases, they may be frozen.
Well, I may be asking a question that's totally irrelevant to everybody in the world, other than the fact that it strikes me as interesting. But obviously, mists and things like flying smoke, they do eventually disperse. But what is it that kind of keeps them together initially? Is there anything that kind of keeps them? Maybe I probably just better delete that whole question from the. But you see where I'm going. Is there any merit to the question at all? Is there a obviously the clouds do kind of stay together, it seems like, for significant periods of time when you look up in the sky. What is it that kind of creates the dividing line?
This is completely, off the top of my head, but there has to be, different temperature differentials in the atmosphere, and at different altitudes, it's going to be colder or warmer. And that's what, sort of, because the thing that always gets me is whenever you can see just for miles and miles, the bottoms of the clouds just look flat.
Yeah.
And you can tell that there's some sort of, almost like a barrier that is keeping them that way. And so there has to be different temperature differentials and wind velocity and that sort of thing. One of the things that always strikes me about clouds is that they look so solid, but you can look away from one for a few minutes and look back, and it's already changed its shape, and then you look back again and it's already changed. But if you sort of like stare at it, it looks like it's, you can't really see it change if you just keep looking at it. It's so slow and so just seems so solid.
Yeah. Of course, we talk a lot about limits and boundaries and so forth. I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, what is it that gives us the perception that there is a boundary between a cloud and the part of the atmosphere that's not within that cloud? Because we're going to be spending a couple of paragraphs here talking about how he thinks thunder results from things rolling around inside the clouds. What is it that gives it a cloud its shape at all? Because I'm sure there's not a very bright dividing line between the edge of the cloud and then the surrounding atmosphere. It's got to be, I presume, it's a dispersal.
Well, there's so many. The things that gets me is there's so many different shapes of clouds too. I mean, you look in photographs online of to identify different clouds and what they mean for the weather and that sort of thing. And it amazes me that there's so many. And there's types of clouds that I have never seen that you'll see photographs online, and it's like I have never seen that shape in the sky before myself. That's why some of the mammatus clouds, I believe, are those large globular sort of looking clouds that are just wild looking.
Yeah. Or maybe, Martin, maybe what I should be trying to frame the discussion as is, how would you generally respond? I presume we don't think that this is a current scientific description of the way that thunder and lightning and so forth work, but it's not entirely off base, is it?
Yes. So interesting. So he bases a lot on observations, and where he sticks close to the observation, it's correct. And where he then tries to infer too far away, then it gets a bit off, like that he thinks that clouds are not like mist, but they are like mist.
And this seems to be a recurring theme too, that his powers of observation are remarkable, and I think that so many times he'll say things that even maybe I haven't thought of before if I've looked at a particular phenomenon. But then whenever he goes, like Martin says, beyond that, then it's like, but you can see the progression at least. You can see he's made the observation and he's trying to make a physical explanation that it's not a supernatural phenomenon, that there's no gods involved in this. And, here's a naturalistic physical explanation for what I'm seeing. And the fact that it's factually wrong doesn't strike me as important as that he's looking for that natural physical reason for things.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. In fact, I don't spend very much time on the seashore or sailing or anything like that, but I thought the discussion of the flapping cloths and sheets and so forth, that's pretty interesting comparison of how the sound from those can sort of be compared to maybe thunder. Do you have a comment about that part, Martin? I don't know why. I guess flags, you hear flags flapping in the wind, and they sort of create I don't even know how flags or sheets or sails flapping in the wind really create the sharp clap that you hear from them.
I would think that he could have used the idea of a whip too.
A whip, yeah. Do you know how that stuff works, Martin? That's a very technical term, stuff.
Yeah, this particular sharp clap of the whip, so done by someone who is skillful at is, what he does is he brings this whip into, he puts a wave on this flexible part of the whip, and because it's typically designed that it goes towards the end, it becomes thinner. So then what happens then, that the acceleration accelerates the tip of the whip to a speed higher than sound. No? So it's probably, the tip of the whip is probably the first object which was accelerated by main to above the speed of sound. No? And at the same time, from the vibration, it also gives off some sound. And because that sound then, so that movement is faster than the speed of sound, these sound waves are compressed into a shock, something like a shock wave. No? So it's basically the same thing when the supersonic jet goes above you. So the same thing is produced by the whip. But that is different what's done in the clouds.
I had never thought of that before, that the whip is the first man-made object to travel faster than sound. That's
is fascinating.
That's a great way to look at that.
It's just operating human muscle. No? You don't need high technology. You just need to design that whip properly and skillful enough to use it. Then just with normal muscle force, you get that tip faster than the speed of sound.
Oh, that's great. That never occurred to me before. But you're absolutely right. That's great.
And I've definitely learned something there. Well, how does that work in comparison with sails or flags or other clapping sounds that come from cloth? They don't go with the speed of sound, do they?
No. Normally not. Probably not. And you will also not perceive this normally as sharp as the sound from the whip.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. The whip sound is very, like you say, it's almost like a jet to some degree. It's very sharp, very sharp.
So my best guess for this with the flag movement is that because they move in waves, no? And if a wave hits the end, depending on how it goes, and now I forgot the detail on this one. So that this wave gets reflected when it hits the end, and then it leads to a sudden movement of this end of the flag, and that might be responsible for this one. Because if the reflection is going to invert the face, then it should move very suddenly to the other side.
Well, in regard to the whip, I do not intuitively think that the whip operates by pushing significant amounts of air, because I would think the tip of the whip is so small that there's not that much air being pushed around. But with a flag or with a theater curtain or just sheets blowing in the wind, I can see more of an issue that they probably do produce their noise by doing something with the air around them. And that would...
They move in waves, and then this wave push around the air. So and this one then generates sound.
Interesting. Well, now you've got me fascinated with the whip thing, too. I don't know what the story of whips would be. How I guess they've had whips for a long time in human history, and there's nothing about that it would be invented at a particular location or time. So I guess that's something that we could expect. That there's no reason not to think that Epicurus would have been familiar with whips and how it makes those noises.
The Romans were definitely familiar with whips.
That's what I was going to exactly where my thought was going, but I wasn't necessarily going to say that. But now that you said it, Don, yes, I would say that whipping people and animals has been a tradition of many types of humans for many different years. So, yeah.
Yeah, but normally if you use this whip properly, you don't even need to hit it. No? So the animals react to that sound. No? The sound is just made in the air, not when it hits some object. No?
That's a great point too.
Yep.
So especially shepherds, no? They won't hit the sheep with a whip. No?
They just want the noise to scare them enough to move them in the right direction.
Yeah. So when you hear people cracking the whip on people or animals or whatever, as long as the whip is cracking, I guess that means they're not necessarily being hurt at that particular moment.
Right.
Yeah, the sound is different. The sound is different when the whip hits something than this crack from reaching the supersonic speed.
Well, I'm reading through several of these passages, trying to find a place to jump on and ask a specific question or bring out a specific point. So as far as what we think the truth is today about thunder and lightning and that kind of noise, you're not going to have sound from just clouds coming in contact with each other. The sound is generated by a lightning strike. Is that correct, Martin?
Yes, so that's normally correct. At least the loud sounds are created by the lightnings, and most lightnings happen actually between clouds. They don't reach the earth. So you may, depending on conditions, you may not even see them, but you can hear the thunder.
What about the rumbling as opposed to a lightning clap? Does the rumbling have any different source to it?
Yeah, when the rumbling is there, it comes from far away, and that means this originally sharp sound of the lightning gets reflected by a lot of objects in the area, by mountains, buildings, and something like this. And as they arrive, they have then it comes then from different total distances. It arrives then at the ear at different times. So that's why this rumbling is then a drawn out thunderstorm.
Okay. So Lucretius is spending some significant time here talking about the composition of the clouds and how that might affect the noise. And he's talking about whether I see references to rain and hail and sleet and snow. I guess that, is there any current viability to that kind of an approach, that a cloud that's got a lot of moisture in it coming into contact with a cloud that doesn't have as much moisture? I guess maybe that generates the rain and the snow and the sleet, maybe, or has some relationship to it, but not any kind of noise, would it? If my question makes any sense.
I mean, you can easily produce some sounds, so I wouldn't completely exclude that some relative movement of clouds may, under certain conditions, produce a slight sound. Now, it will not be like that, from thunder or something particularly loud, but I wouldn't completely exclude the possibility.
Well, I do see one thing worthy of at least making a reference to, about how in this 145 I see the reference to, as when a fire raging with mighty force is driven by rushing winds upon a hill covered with laurels and sets all in a blaze. For nothing burns with a more dreadful noise and crackling flame than the leaves of the Delphic laurel sacred to Apollo. So there's a couple of points there that might be of interest. I've never thought of laurel leaves as being particularly combustible, but I guess there is another analogy to be talking about here in terms of fire making noise. What do you think about fire making noise? I guess there is crackling. Well, the crackling flame comes from the combustion of the material that's being consumed, right? Or does the fire itself in the air generate sound?
I mean, because it's everything is there on the move, so it's an interaction between the air around it, and of course, if you push around air, this will produce sound.
So it is kind of a reasonable analogy for Lucretius to be talking about fire and using that as another point of reference, just like he can hear claps from cloth and flags and curtains flapping. I guess you do hear cracks or you hear different sounds coming out of a raging flame.
I think it's interesting, too, that he uses the analogy of a blacksmith putting a red hot iron into cold water, and it is trying to extrapolate from that, too. That's an interesting little observation there.
Yeah, I thought there might be something interesting to say about the leaves of the laurel sacred to Apollo being particularly combustible, but I don't know how I could derive any meaning from. He seems to think that those make a particularly dreadful noise. I don't know why.
I don't know. I never burnt laurel wood myself, so I'm not quite sure what. And the only other thing that we could squeeze out of that is that even though it's sacred to the god Apollo, it's still going to burn. So
yeah. I mean, I still don't fully understand this paragraph. So I mean, I understand if a lightning hits those dry leaves, yes, this is likely to cause a fire. So, but it seems he's also talking about fire in the cloud, and I don't see how this will happen, because normally the clouds are made of mist, or you have rare cases where clouds are made of dust. But this dust is normally not combustible unless it's something like human-made, like the sawdust or something like that. That can catch fire.
Yeah, it almost seems like he's trying to say that there are dry clouds and wet clouds.
Yeah.
Whereas the dry clouds would be dust clouds. No?
Something like that.
Yeah, that would be what we would say, but it does. I think what Don was saying is that he wrongly thinks that some clouds may be more dry than others, just normal. I guess maybe it's not wrong to say that, is that some clouds carry more rain than others do. That's another good question. Are clouds all just water vapor? Are they made of anything besides water vapor?
No, they're droplets. No? So that's where we see them. I mean, this is how they're formed. The water evaporates, and on the ground, the air rises with that water vapor mixed into the air, and when it gets to the cooler temperature up there, then it reaches the saturation temperature. Then the saturation is reached, and the water condenses into droplets. And if it's very cold, they may freeze, so that you have frozen mist there in the cloud. These very high cirrus clouds you see normally in fair weather. So they're high up, and they're made of small pieces of ice. Whereas the lower clouds you see are normally of water droplets.
But that might explain why we might have a difficulty with this passage, is that we today would presume that every cloud is made up of water vapor. We would not think there could be such a thing as a dry cloud, because all clouds are made up of water vapor. But maybe he didn't understand that and thought that some clouds can be made up of something besides water vapor.
There can be dust clouds, and I think in Italy you see them more frequently than in Germany, because the Sahara is quite closer and they don't need to pass the barrier of the Alps to go there. So I'm pretty sure that it was a common sight in summer to see dust clouds from the Sahara above Rome.
Well, that could definitely be true too, and I could also be putting too much weight on just this particular translation. Maybe dry cloud is not something that is actually in the Latin.
So the only thing which is somehow doesn't fit, that this dry cloud would burn. So that dust is basically ground up stone, and stone doesn't burn.
Yeah, because it does look like he's clearly talking about a cloud receiving flame and then bursting into flame and so forth to explain the lightning. And obviously we would not agree that that's flame is what's going on. But I guess maybe that's one of the key aspects of this whole discussion here, is that in looking at thunder and lightning, he's equating lightning to a form of flame, which I think we presumably would not do, right, Martin? I mean, or is there any analogy or relevance at all between lightning and flame? Maybe I shouldn't presume.
The analogy is it's both. No, the analogy is both temperature. So if you see a fire, that means then the air becomes hot enough that it emits a visible light which we can see in sufficient intensity. And that's the same thing. When the lightning passes through the channel of ionized air, then it heats it up sufficiently that this air becomes hot, and that's why we see the lightning.
So you would not consider it to be a gross misstatement to talk about lightning in terms of fire?
No, it's not. It's not really completely wrong. The only thing is that normally up there you don't really have something to feed a fire. So that's why it's just short. It heats up the air during the discharge, and it cools down very quickly. So that's why it's just short. Whereas when the lightning hits the ground, combustible material, then you have something what can maintain the fire. And then you see the lasting effect of some material burning.
And Cassius, you mentioned, or you asked the question whether he actually used the word dry clouds in the Latin. And sure enough, there is the word that is aridus is the word that's used in it. So it's dry and withered and arid and parched. And so he definitely is talking about dry clouds.
Well, that's point number 2 of my basic physics education for today then, is I did not understand how whips work. And it strikes me as something new in my own thinking to think that it is reasonable to be analogizing lightning and fire. I thought that was just something I wouldn't even consider as an appropriate reference, but more to it than I realized.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I mean, we were talking briefly about his powers of observation, and I thought it was interesting in paragraph 164 that he talks specifically about that images move faster than sound. And I don't know why it struck me as being a modern observation, but I mean, he talks about somebody cutting a tree down, that you see them moving the axe before you hear the thud of the axe on the tree. And he even says that we see the lightning before we hear the thunder. So it's like, yeah.
Right. I wonder if it goes into next week, but when you say that, Don, it seems to me that I picked up a reference to, I guess we're closing in on the 164, the end of the material that we had for today. And I thought I saw something even more specific that used the word image, going back to his discussion of the Epicurean term of images. Seems like I saw some reference somewhere in this material today that he was making an example of how the images move more slowly than something else. Gee. Okay, now this may be a translation issue, but now I see it. It does say it in Browne 164 here. For the images of things approach our ears much slower than they reach our eyes. So he is making the direct observation that sound would travel less quickly than light, but I guess I'd have to dig back into the word images here to see whether that would be something that would also apply to his generic term of images when he talks about everything giving off images which are not the same as necessarily light. This may be a reference to him saying that images of things don't travel at the same speed as light does. I'm probably putting too much weight on that right now. I'll just maybe make a note that if somebody were studying the detailed analysis of Epicurean views of images, that might want to look at that one. But he clearly is saying, though, the result being that light travels faster than sound.
Yeah, but it's a bit of weird formulation to talk of sound images. No?
Well, that's exactly why I raised that issue. If in fact, let's look at the other translations so to see if Bailey says, because things always travel more slowly to the ears than to the eyes. And that was Monroe, and Bailey says things too. So I don't know whether he's using the same technical term of image or not. Because if he just says things travel more slowly to the ears than to the eyes.
And I think it is things, because he seems to use, at least from what I can see here in my rudimentary Latin, that he uses res, R-E-S, as things. So the things move, and the Latin is talking about, the oculi, the eyes, and the oris, the ears.
Are you seeing res in this particular? Did you have the logo in front of you? Okay.
Correct. Yeah, it's on line 166. It looks like is the last word on that line.
But it is interesting to think, though, the basic principle of physics being, I think, one of them, that all atoms travel at the same speed.
Well, at least initially, I think. I mean, they all move in a straight line at the same speed until they're acted upon by the swerve or bumping into another atom.
Yeah, the bumping into the other atom would clearly restrict their ability to move in a straight line. But is it, Martin, and this is going back into particle physics, kind of have the impression he thinks that at the atomic level, even if they bounce off of each other, the shortened motion may be the same speed as straight line motion. I may be wrong in saying that, but what about particle physics? Do we take the position today that all particles travel at the same speed as they move around?
No, photons, they travel with the speed of light. And about everything else is slower than that, typically. And and it varies. No? So depending on what particle is moving, it can be much slower than the speed of light, depending on what accelerator.
I should be more specific with the term particles. I guess that we have to say at the very deepest level of subatomic particles, at that level, even if they may bounce off of something else, are they moving at the same speed, or to some at that very ultimate subatomic level, some moving faster than others?
No, it's a wrong assumption by.
Okay.
One thing I think too, if he's using the word race to mean things or objects, and that things or objects reach our eyes before they do our ears, he could also just be referring to the fact that the object out there reaches our eyes first before it reaches our ears, instead of actually talking about the images or the particles or the atoms reaching our eyes. The object out there reaches us however he wants to say that, but since he's using the word things or objects, it could be a sort of hedging his bets a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we may be coming close to the end of what we can get out of today's material, and I don't have in front of me what we're going to do next week to build a bridge.
I think there's more thunder and lightning and rain and earthquakes and.
Yeah.
Have I mentioned this before?
Yeah, because you're still waiting for the death and destruction part of the plague.
The sweet release of death.
Yeah, I see that we're stopping at 164 today, but 173 is going to continue on with clouds and clouds and thunderbolts. So we may be directly involved in thunder and lightning for at least another episode.
We may have to get a guest meteorologist or something.
Yeah. Boy, we may have 2 more episodes on it the way I'm seeing here.
Oh, yeah.
Because it looks like we may be basically talking about thunder and lightning all the way until. I wonder if we do that all the way till we get to the plague of Athens, but.
I see wind on line 295. I see.
But wait a minute. I remember somewhere in here we get into magnetism, which I'm very interested to talk about. And so
I think that's up around line 900 or something like that.
So there's some other issues besides thunder.
So we may just, what we might want to do is consider maybe even reading more than 100 lines. That's going to be a lot of reading, but we might want to see how we can split this up so that we're not talking about clouds for 4 weeks. So we might want to see how we can split that up. Just taking our listeners, into concern. We don't want to, we don't want to overburden them with cloud talk. Very, very
I'll definitely look at that in preparing the text for next week and see how we want to read a little bit longer than usual. Well, let's go ahead and start wrapping it up for today. Now that you've educated me on whips and fire and clouds, Martin, do you have any other general comments for today?
No, I'm fine. I've said everything I needed to say.
Okay, very good. Don?
I'm good for today.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up, and that will make it easier for me to edit and get it out hopefully earlier this week. So we'll come back next week and continue with meteorology. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.